Hey, and welcome back to another video. And in this video, we're going to talk about closures and how we can use them to communicate between views in SwiftUI. So some of you may have realized in my videos that you'll see me typing out something like this. So this is actually called a closure. And before we actually dive into how we can use closures in our views, it's probably worth us just quickly discussing what a closure is and how they actually benefit us in our code. So we're going to look at how we can use closures in Swift and where they are currently used within the Swift language. So let's actually create a Swift playground in our project. So first of all, let's just delete this closure because we're not actually going to be using it in this example. But let's actually create a new playground. So we just hit File, New, and then we'll create a new playground. And then you don't have to give this a specific name. You can call this whatever you want. I'm just gonna put this on the desktop just for now. Cool. So you should get this new playground where you can just like quickly test out and run code and whatnot. And what we're going to do in here is we're actually going to just go through a few closure examples. So a closure is a special type of function without a name. You can actually create a closure by using just the curly braces and then assigning them to some kind of variable. Let's actually create a closure where we just print out our name. So we'll type this one out together. So if we just do something like this where we have greet, and then in order to actually create a closure here, in order to actually create a type of closure here, we can just create the curly braces, and then within here we're just going to say print, and then we're just going to say hello world. So basically what we're saying here is that we want to execute whatever is within the curly braces whenever we call this greet here. So this will essentially just act as a function for us. So now if we just go down a bit and we actually use this like a function, you see that when you hit the play button on the playground here after line 9, you should see that your message is printed into the console like so. So this is kind of like a way of you writing a function without actually declaring the func keyword. It's just you writing some kind of inline function. But we're not just limited to having a function with no params. If we wanted to, we could actually tell our function that we want to pass something into it. So let's actually see how we can pass this in a name with a closure. So in order to do this, we'll need to pass in a parameter. So let's do this now. So after your greet, we'll create a new greeting called proper greeting. And in order to pass in a parameter, you need to use the following syntax. So what we're saying here is that we want to pass in a parameter with the name, and then what we're going to do is actually access this name and then print it down. So let's do that now. Cool. So the main thing to note here is that when you're working with closures and you want to pass in something into it, then you need to make sure that you have the in keyword afterwards. And also as well, we just specified here a parameter. Now let's just see how to use this. So now in order to use this, you just call it like you would a function, and now we can actually pass in our name. And when we hit play on line 15, you'll see that it actually prints out the name that we passed through our closure. So now you can actually do some kind of operation within this closure if you wanted to. So also as well, you may also want to have a closure where you only want to pass something in, but you also want to do some kind of calculation so it returns some kind of value as well. And we can actually do this by passing in a value like we've done before, but also returning some kind of value as well. So what we're going to do now is we're going to type another type of greeting where we pass in our name, but it also returns to us the string message that is created. So let's do that now. So if we just type out let, and then we say real greeting, and then we'll just do the curly braces first. So now in order to actually return a value, we need to specify our parameter like so. And then after the parameter, you then want to specify what you want to return. So in this case, we want to return a string. And then what we're going to do now is actually build out a message and then return this. So as you can see, we've got an error now, and that's because our closure is telling us that we actually need to return some kind of string. So let's return our message like so. So in order to actually use this, like we would before, we can now capture this value. So we say real greeting. And then now the value that we have calculated within our closure is now returned to us. So this will now hold the value real greeting tons. So let's actually print this out to see it in action. Cool. So now if we print this out, you'll now see that it says real greeting tons. So this allows us to pass in a value and also return it. Now it's also worth noting as well that when you're working with closures, you don't have to use both of these. These are configurable, so you can actually, swap them in and out. So let's say, for example, we want to have a closure that doesn't return anything at all. All we need to do, if we just copy this, and then if we just remove this parameter here, so what we're saying here is that we've got our parameter list, which is void. So void meaning that we're not passing anything in, and we can just use this like so. And you should see that this is actually valid, and it prints to the console. So if you just want to have a closure that doesn't take any parameters but returns something, then you want to use this here, which denotes void. So you may be wondering, okay, but what use cases is this actually useful in? Well, two use cases, and we're going to go over how closures can help us when we're building our SwiftUI apps. So the first case is with asynchronous programming, and if you want to learn more about the difference between synchronous and asynchronous programming, so check out my video Getting Started with Swift Concurrency, which is a free online course on everything you need to know about the new Swift concurrency framework. So let's type out a function that will simulate us fetching some data from an API. So just below this, if we just type this out, a function. So what we have here is an array of names, Tons, Billy, and Bob. And then we've also got this here. So this is dispatch queue main. And what this is a function that actually executes asynchronously. So it's saying that at 1.5 seconds from now, we want to execute whatever is written within here. So notice that within Swift itself, there are also closures as well, because this closure here is actually executing the code that happens within it. So you may be wondering here, okay, so in an API request, you get some data, it comes back in and you return it, right? So how can we return this fake data from within this closure after 1.5 seconds? So you may be wondering that you can do something like this after your fetch, where you say return a string, and then within here we want to return some fake data. Now if you actually run this within your Swift playgrounds, you'll notice that you'll actually have an error, and this isn't going to work. And the reason why is because this dispatch queue here is actually a closure, like I mentioned before. So it actually has its own scope, and it's actually expecting you to return void. So it expects you to return nothing. So when you're working with closures like this and you want to return some value within a closure, you actually don't do the return here. Instead, what you need to do is create something called a completion handler. So a completion handler is essentially a closure that you can call within a closure. So let's do that now. Okay, cool. So now that we have our completion here, so this is our completion handler here, and within our completion handler we got two things. So we have our return and we also have our parameters. So let's actually break this down. So the first one we have here is our parameters, and the whole purpose of this is so we can actually capture the values that we pass through from our asynchronous function. So this will allow us to actually pass through our data so we can access it from our fetch function. And then within here, we're saying we want to return void. So remember, this closure here was saying that it expects us to return void, which is why this is void. So in order to actually use this, what we want to do now is we actually want to call this completion handler within this closure block here. So let's do that now. So in order to do that, we just say completion, and then we say some fake data like so. So now what this will do is we'll actually pass through our fake data via our completion handler for our function, so we can access this data here. And now we've got another error here, and you may be wondering, well, what's the issue here and why can't we use this closure like this, like we did in our other examples? Well, the problem here is that we're actually trying to call a closure from within another one that is asynchronous, because we delayed it for 1.5 seconds. So Swift doesn't know when this here will actually execute. So since this is the case, what we need to do, since we're nesting closures, we need to fix this by using the escaping attribute on our closure. So Swift knows that this is when we want to exit outside of this closure with our own function parameter. So let's do this now. So in order to fix this, before your parameter here, you want to use the @escaping keyword. So you just want to add this, and this is what you always want to add in whenever you have a completion handler within another closure like this, like so. So in order to actually use this, let's actually use our function. So if we just say fetch, and then you'll now see that we have our completion. This is the parameter that you're able to access here, which is our array of fake names. So our data that's getting passed through our function, we can now print this out to the console like so. So now let's just run this and see what happens. And you'll now see after 1.5 seconds, it now prints out our name like so. So in this example, we're able to handle passing back a value when we work with asynchronous code. So now that we saw this example with our business logic, what about our SwiftUI views? So let's actually go back into our example and we'll create a new view called action button. So in your SwiftUI project, let's create a new SwiftUI view called action button. And within the SwiftUI view, we're just going to add in a button like so. And then let's actually use this view within our content view. Cool. So now if we run this on the SwiftUI preview, you should see your button on the screen like so. Cool. So now in our view, I actually want to create some kind of source of truth that handles toggling the color of a rectangle on the screen. So let's just add in a source of truth for this. So we've got our source of truth is active and it's a boolean because we want to toggle between true or false. And then what we're going to do is actually embed our action button in a VStack and add a rounded rectangle where we actually animate any changes. So we just got it here, if we just run this, we just got a rounded rectangle on the screen and we're just setting the corner radius to 8. And then we're saying that the fill is going to be dependent on whether it's active or not. So if this is active, we want this to be red. If not, it's green, which is what it is now. And we're just going to give it a size of 150 by 150. So you may think that this is going to work, but we actually have a problem now. And the problem is that how do we actually communicate from our action button to our content view that someone has tapped on tap me? Because right now there's actually no way for our action button to actually pass through the tap action. Well, this is why we can use closures to actually solve this problem. So what we can actually do is actually call our closure when the button is tapped, and by doing this it will actually trigger it within our content view. So let's do this now. So we go into our action button, let's create a closure here. And like I said before, this closure here doesn't actually take in any parameters, so it's void, and it also returns void as well. So we should get an error in our SwiftUI preview. And in order to fix that, we just need to add in the curly braces like so. Okay, cool. And if we go back into our content view, if you build the project, you should notice that you actually get an error on your action button. Cool. So now within our action button closure, we actually want to call the code to actually trigger toggling our is active. So we want to change this to true and false, so toggle its value. So we want to wrap this in a with animation block, and we're going to say is active.toggle like so. So now let's just run this and see what happens. So if we just run this now and we hit tap me, you'll notice that nothing is actually happening. And the reason why nothing is happening is because if you actually look at our action button, if I'm just going to pin this content view onto the screen. If you actually look at our action button, although we did create the closure, in our button, we're actually not doing anything, so nothing's gonna happen. So how do we actually trigger this closure to actually, call it within our content view? Well, in order to actually trigger it, we actually need to call our action like we did before in our example before, almost like a function. So let's do that now. So all we need to do is say action and then call it like a function. So what's going to happen now is whenever you tap on this button, it's actually going to call this closure and trigger it within our content view here. So now let's test it out. So you now tap me, you'll now see that it actually animates the changes with our rounded rectangle. So this actually allows us to communicate between our views. But we've just done a simple example where we had no parameters, where we were passing that through a closure. What about if we actually want to pass some data through like an enum? Well, we can actually pass this back through a closure as well. So let's actually add in another button into our action button that actually handles scaling this rectangle down. And if you want to learn more about animations, then check out my video, Animations in SwiftUI, which is in the SwiftUI Sessions playlist. So let's go back into our action button view. And then this time within this strut, I'm just going to create a enum called action. And then within this enum, we're going to give it two cases. The first case is going to be color, and the second case is going to be scale. So this is the action that we're going to use to communicate back to our view that this is what we want you to perform. So someone's tapped on color or someone's tapped on scale. So what we need to do now is actually create two new buttons for actually handling these actions. So let's do that now. So I'm just going to embed this in a VStack. And then what I'm going to do is actually duplicate this button here. And then this time we're going to change the text on the first one to say toggle color. And then the second one is going to say toggle scale. Cool. So if you actually just run this on our SwiftUI preview, you should now see that you have your two buttons on the screen. But if you tap on this button, it toggles the color. But if you tap on the scale button, it's also toggling the color as well. And the reason why both of them are calling the closure, but we're actually not sending back any data to tell our view what we want it to perform. So how do we handle this? Well, what we need to do now is we actually need to update our action closure here to pass in some kind of enum to communicate to the view what we want it to perform. So let's update this now. So now that we've done that, we're saying here that we're going to pass through the action within this closure, and we should get some errors. So the first error that we're going to fix here is our SwiftUI preview, and it's complaining because now that we've added in this type as a parameter, it actually expects it and we've not declared it. So just to get around this, what you can do is just use the underscore and then say in, and that should resolve that error. And now within our two closures here, we want to specify the action that we want to use. So in this case, we want it to be color, like so. And then the second one, we want it to be dot scale. So now we're passing through the enum into any views that use action button. So if we go back into our content view, we'll also have an error as well. And that's because we need to use the argument that we pass through. So in here, let's just specify action in like so. And then now what we're going to do is we're going to change the source of truth depending on what action was passed through this button. So we're going to do that with a switch statement. So let's just type out switch, and then we're going to say action, and we should automatically get the cases that are being passed through. And if it is color, then we're going to use this here on our color. And then what we want to do on our scale is we actually want to create a new source of truth for actually toggling the scale on our screen. So let's do that now. So underneath is active, we're going to create called is scale. Cool. And then we want to literally copy the same animation block and toggle in within our scale. But this time, I'm going to change the animation to be a spring type animation so it looks nicer. Sweet. And then finally, what we want to do is we actually want to use this is scaled on our rounded rectangle. So after the frame, I'm just going to set the scale effect to be 1 or 0.5, depending on whether this is true or false. So let's just type this out. So we're going to say if it is scaled, then we want it to be 0.5. And if it's false, then we want it to be 1. So when this is set to true, this will actually scale it down. And when it's not set to true, so when this is false, it will just basically go back to 1, which is original size. Okay, cool. So now let's actually just run this and see what happens. So we hit resume. If we hit toggle color, you'll see that our toggle color is working fine. So this case here is being executed via our closure. But this time, if we hit toggle scale, you'll now see that we're actually able to scale down the view. So now we're actually using this case here specifically to scale it. And if we do toggle color again, we can change the color of it, and we can also scale it back up as well. So we're actually able to pass through different actions via enums via our closure. So this is how you can actually create and pass data through your views as well if you want to. But just before we wrap up, I just want to show you how we can actually clean up our closures with type aliases. So let's go back into our action button. And within here, you'll notice that we actually have this closure. And if you actually look at it, on first glance, it's actually not clear what this actually means. So what we can actually do is we can actually create something called a type alias so that our closure is actually more readable. So let's do that now. Cool. So now what we've said here is that we've basically associated this closure with this type here. So if we wanted to use this closure, rather than having to type out all of this, we just need to type out button action, and we've declared the type on our action like so. So this is a lot clearer and easier to read. Okay, cool. So that's everything in this video. If you enjoyed this video, I'd really appreciate if you left some feedback in the comment section below. Also as well, if you haven't already, I'd really appreciate it if you gave this video a thumbs up, as well as subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell to get updates whenever I release a new video. That's everything from me. I'll catch you on a bit. Deuces.